Well, I think his long-term strategy so far is to keep going. There might be a pause, there might be a ceasefire, but he still wants to essentially annihilate Ukraine as a country. He's more or less said that.
Finkelstein here, sitting for Carol Walker on Times Radio. Today was a day for diplomatic solidarity with the Ukrainian people. The French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi all arrived in Kiev in a show of support for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's president took his guests to war-torn sites such as Irpin, where the French president said massacres had taken place. Meanwhile, the UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said Russia's artillery outnumbers Ukraine's 20-1 in some parts of the country. But speaking earlier today, he said this could change in the coming weeks.
I think the Ukrainians have and will have in the next few weeks the capabilities in their hands to make significant progress in the east of the country, or indeed to defend the likes of places like Odessa. We're starting to see now flowing in anti-ship missiles, which of course only a few weeks ago was unlikely to be there. There will be in the tens, if not hundreds, of anti-ship missiles that will start protecting that coastline. So I think you're going to see the direction of travel going to be much more hostile for Russian forces. It's going to be harder for them to do what they want to do. And I think that the next big question is, can the Ukrainians then push them back or push them out of the country? And only time will tell.
That was UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. Joining me now is Angela Stent, former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and former senior NATO advisor, and also author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, I suppose the first question is, this show of solidarity, does it mean anything? Obviously, anybody can fly anywhere. We call it a big moment of solidarity. Was it anything more than just a sort of press photo call?
Well, I think it was very important, a morale booster anyway, because none of these leaders has actually been to Kiev until now. They waited a long time. And I think they, reinforced the idea that the European Union countries support Ukraine. I mean, after all, Prime Minister Johnson's been there much earlier. So it's the support and then the promise also of a possible candidate membership for Ukraine in the European Union, which of course would be a long way off. But again, it's sort of emphasizing that they consider Ukraine part of Europe. Now, having said that, what Ukraine really needs, as we've just heard, is all the heavy weaponry. And even with the $1 billion new promise of military assistance from the U.S. and Britain's providing them, and also some other NATO countries, not too much has arrived yet. I mean, this stuff needs to arrive soon. Otherwise, it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to sort of hold off the Russians, who are about to take the whole of the Luhansk region and the town of Severodonetsk. So they do need the ammunition.
Why did it take them this long to go? You say it was quite a while since Boris Johnson has been. I didn't really understand that.
I think they were concerned about the Russian reaction. They were overly cautious. Maybe they were worried about security. I mean, they had to go by train, obviously, from Poland to Ukraine because you can't fly. The commercial airports are all closed. That may have been it. It was a sort of hesitation, waiting to see what happened. So it would have probably been better if they would have gone earlier, but at least they went now, and that was an important statement.
Where do we lie now on the issue of EU membership? If you get these leaders of the EU visiting Ukraine, that's bound to have been central to the discussion. President Zelensky's made no secret of regarding that as a central part of his desire to make Ukraine a sort of part of the West. And I wonder whether you thought it was something that the EU could grant, and whether you thought that today it might have seen a move in that direction.
Well, I remember, 10, 15 years ago talking with EU officials and saying, you should give Ukraine a membership perspective. Yes, it's got lots of problems, corruption, weak institutions, but the perspective should help discipline it and make it understand what it has to do. So I think today we have Ursula von der Leyen, who's says she believes that Ukraine should get candidate membership. You've got the three leaders of the three European countries who say that it should. But I think it's still the European Council has to take a vote on this. And there are people who are skeptical about it. I'm sure Hungary will be an outlier. It's already been an outlier on a number of other things. So I think the chances of Ukraine saying that it can get candidate membership are pretty good. Better today after we heard what even Macron said. And then, of course, it will be a very, very long process going forward. But I think since NATO membership is obviously off the table, this really would be important for Ukraine, a perspective for it, once the war is over.
Can the EU really offer membership to an organisation, to a country in its organisation, which it's not willing to admit to NATO? In other words, it's not willing to defend if it comes under attack, having made the explicit decision not to admit it to NATO, pretty much because it wasn't willing to sustain it against attack. So how does it work that a country could be? I can understand why a country might choose to be an EU member and not a member of NATO, but how does it work that you say we'll allow you to join the EU, but you can't join NATO?
Well, of course, I was going to say Finland and Sweden, were EU members but not NATO members. Of course, that's changing now. I mean, it's theoretically possible. I think what we're talking about is something that's very far down the road. To actually have Ukraine become a member of the European Union. And by then you may also have more variable geometry, the kinds of things that Macron has talked about, sort of different kinds of circles. But I agree with you. It does leave open the question of who's going to defend Ukraine. I mean, in the beginning, Zelensky and his other officials said, his colleagues said, they were willing, if there were to be a negotiated peace with Russia, and this is now the beginning of April, they were willing to accept neutrality, but with security guarantees from other countries. Now, again, the question is, the devil's in the details. What would those security guarantees look like? And, of course, what Ukraine would want is something that looks like an Article 5 from NATO. But we haven't heard much about that since April with, after all the atrocities were discovered and after Putin has now explicitly said that, it's not only Ukraine, it could be other countries, that discussion has died down. But I think that would clearly, once Ukraine looked as if it was closer to getting EU membership, the issue of defending it would clearly have to be discussed too.
20-1. That was a pretty striking figure, which we heard earlier, in which Ben Wallace was saying he thought liable to change. But that is a sobering, worrying figure. You're not going to put that right, as it were, anytime soon, surely. And how can a country be sustained when it has that kind of imbalance?
Well, it's obviously extremely difficult. And, in the beginning, we were all amazed by how well the Ukrainians did because the Russian army was so disorganized and inefficient and ineffective. But the Russian army has learned something from the mistakes it made in February and March, and it's performing better now. I mean, obviously, there's still problems. So it's still a very hard road for the Ukrainians. If they get these heavy weapons and long-range missile systems and they can really push back against the Russians, they stand a better chance of succeeding. But still, the Russians have already taken over quite a bit of territory. They now control 20% of Ukraine's territory. I think it was 15% before the war began. But that's still a sizable challenge to try and reverse that.
So the US long-range systems and European long-range systems, is that going to make a big military difference?
Well, it should help them, again, sort of push back and attack Russian targets, which they can't attack now. But the Russians still have lots of weapons that they can use. They may not be the most up-to-date advanced weapons, but they can still use them. So I think it's very hard to say how well the Ukrainians will do, even if they get those weapons. But we haven't seen yet because they don't have them.
Okay, well, I don't want to waste having somebody with a strategic vision asking them only tactical questions. So let's move to the strategic field. If this is a war, to use your words, Russia against the West and with the rest, what is President Putin's long-term strategy of which this forms a part? And then let's discuss in a second how we counter that long-term strategy.
Well, I think his long-term strategy so far is to keep going. there might be a pause, there might be a ceasefire, but he still wants to essentially annihilate Ukraine as a country. He's more or less said that. He wanted to, and the former President Dmitry Medvedev wrote that yesterday, just get rid of Ukraine as a state. And then I think what he wants to do is to form a Slavic Union of Belarus, which is already very dependent on Russia and Ukraine, and possibly northern Kazakhstan. So he definitely sees himself as an imperial restorer. We heard that when he likened himself to Peter the Great a couple of days ago. And then we don't know where else he would go from there. So that's assuming he can do that. I'm not saying he can, but I think that is his long-range goal, as long as he's in the Kremlin, is going to try and destroy the Ukrainian state, or at least have a government there that is subservient to Moscow and doesn't look west anymore. And then beyond that, he's already turned to China. As the book title is Against the West and With the Rest, and we've seen how China, and yesterday Xi Jinping again explicitly backed Russia and what it's doing. So it's then cultivating the ties with China and then with India and all of the other countries that haven't condemned or sanctioned Russia. And that's all of the BRICS, and it's a lot of countries in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America, including Mexico, which is supposed to be a close partner of the United States. So I think that's, again, going forward, his vision is of Russia still as a great power with more territory, but really not interacting with the U.S. and Europe or Australia, Japan, and South Korea, but having all these other partners around the globe.
And what do we do? Just live with that?
Well, I think, first of all, in Europe, you have to have super containment, and we have to make sure that Putin doesn't set his sights on, for instance, Poland, which was hinted at one of the treaties that Russia submitted to NATO in December. So it's sort of tough containment. And then I suppose it's trying to persuade some of these other countries that they should sort of rethink being unwilling to take any moves against Russia, but that's going to be difficult. It's going to be like during the Cold War, the original Cold War, when we had a block of non-aligned states, who didn't want to choose sides, and they didn't choose sides. So I think it's particularly hard for the United States and Europe because they're facing a combined Russia and China. So, we certainly still, the West, the U.S., Europe, and those Asian allies, they have much of the world's GDP. They're the most advanced countries. They have greater geopolitical heft than the rest of these countries. But with a rising China, it's going to be harder, to maintain this containment of Russia.
Well, Angela Stent, who's former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and former senior NATO advisor, and as I've said, an author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with that view of both the tactics and the strategy on this day of diplomatic solidarity with Ukraine. It's Daniel Finkelstein. You're listening to Times Radio. I'm sitting in for Carol Walker, and it's 23:18:21. I was asked to give a time check, and there it is.